By 2050, the estimates are that most Africans will be living in cities, and they'll be living in contexts where local governments have less funds to invest in public infrastructure. And it's unclear what it will mean, what this growth, plus also this sort of like underfunded public authorities will be able to do in terms of making people's lives in cities better. As it is, many people in African cities make their own solutions. They collectively organize to source water, to sort out sewage problems, to build housing, to build roads, to build drains.
So do it yourself can come in very handy in terms of how the community organizes itself. We know the role that there is need for the role of the government, but there are issues also for people to take responsibility.
I think that DIY is just something I think that people are already doing. Sort of figuring out how to provide infrastructure, get access to resources, housing. I mean, people are already doing that. So I think part of the task is, from the academic side, is to come up with a way to conceptualize this concept, but also to figure out the policy and practical implications. Like what happens at that interface between formal state planning and informalized do-it-yourself practices, and how do we link those? How do we bring those into conversation?
Do it yourself. I mean, is it a moral imperative saying to people, you need or you should engage in these activities where you do it yourself, provide for your own self-interest? I see a difficulty there where it becomes under conditions of austerity. Municipal authorities that don't have resources tell people to go do it on their own. And so rather than becoming a source of empowerment, it becomes a source of further exploitation. In many instances, local neighborhoods are deceived by the city government, where they're convinced that somehow they're being empowered because they can clean up the neighborhood, rebuild parks and so forth, when in fact what it's basically doing is engaging in using their unpaid labor to do what the city doesn't want to do, because the city's too busy paying huge amount of money to real estate developers to get them to invest in certain parts of the downtown core.
To do it yourself as a poor person means something quite different than to do it yourself as a rich person. So so if you live in a slum area and you're just having to sort of basically figure out how do we get access to water on a regular basis, or how do we provide housing, or how do we sort of provide some basic infrastructure. I mean, that becomes perhaps a good thing in the sense that it brings people together, but it also perhaps represents a position of weakness or lack of power in a given society, because you would compare that to a rich person or a rich neighborhood as a gated community, which has their own power grid or their own police force, and they have the ability to sort of opt out of collective or common problems. And so they're both do it yourself, but one's but depending on your position in society and your power, economic class, the DIY perhaps means very different things. And the project here is really putting the focus on poorer people to figure out how we can sort of harness their creativity and sort of the collective to make cities more just and work better for the most marginal members of cities.
Because on one hand, this idea of doing it yourself is celebrated, as something that is great and fantastic. But then on the other hand, it can be critiqued as a way of state actors and people who have a lot more resources and money to say, well, just work hard, just put in your own energy and your creativity, and all the problems will be sorted out. By saying people should do it themselves, are we then saying that that public solutions should be met by individual and private beings? Roads are shared, drainages for water shared, water is part of one ecosystem.
And I'm worried about the ecology of the environment, where you have water not being provided and people have to dig boreholes all in all the areas. It has implications for the ecology, it has implications for climate change. In terms of DIY, therefore, how can people do it within the former frame and also be responsible for what they're doing, but where the government needs to come in handy so that people don't suffer in the end, like you have a building set up. The poor invest their own spendings, and at the end of the day, the structures get destroyed because they have to have, there has to be planning, to accommodate what is going on. But sometimes it's not accommodated, sometimes they pay a big price.
And that's where I think DIY urbanism as a concept, as a sort of generating concept, can help us enter into those kinds of discussions in ways that get beyond the old distinction between formality and informality.
How is that? Why?
In part because it carries with it, I think, this baggage that informality becomes a kind of lack of, or becomes the sort of, informality becomes something not formal, where the formal sets the standard, that informality is everything that aspires to that standard but doesn't quite reach it. In that sense, informality in certainly in conventional urban planning, informality is something that needs to be eradicated. It's not far-sighted enough to understand what's actually going on in cities, in distressed cities today, because informality or outside of regulation or outside of legal frameworks is where most people operate on an everyday basis.